Dear ladies and gentlemen, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to the third day of the conference on the road to responsible sourcing. This conference is run as a part of the EU project Resourcing by the Institute for Managing Sustainability at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. My name is Ursula Kopp. I'm specialized in facilitation of innovation processes and of multi-stakeholder dialogues. And I'm also part of the team of this Institute for Managing Sustainability here in Vienna at the Business University. I'm your facilitator for this conference. This conference is the second conference of this EU project Resourcing. In the opening conference in January this year, we looked at the key drivers of responsible sources. And with this conference on the road to sustainable sourcing, we want to tackle the big question whether and how responsible sourcing of mineral raw materials can achieve impact for both the society and the environment. The question is not very complex, but the answers are sometimes. Therefore, it is being addressed from 3 different angles on the 3 days of the conference. On day 1, on Monday, we heard and discussed a lot about due diligence in the supply chain. Yesterday, the day 2, our topic included some high-level presentations and discussions on green transition. And we heard about the resourcing project's new roadmap 2050 for responsible sourcing in the renewable energy sector. And today, last but not least, we want to look at the intersection of circular economy and responsible sourcing. The recording of all 3 days will stay available on the conference website in the section Resources. If you are registered, you have access to that. And we are very proud to say that we have already 440 registered people who signed in for this conference from all over the world, which is amazing, and about 50 from industry. So we are very glad to have you with us. But with this type of virtual conferences, we never know exactly who is in and who's out at the moment. But if you're here now and if you want to participate live in the conference, you can do so via using the Slido chat on the website. You just need to click on the live button and then enter the Slido chat. And then you can ask questions at any time. Please do so at any time during the conference, or you can comment on things, or you can even write to each other if you want to do. And I would also like to mention, if you need any kind of technical support, please write an email to my colleague Andreas, who's in the background with some other colleagues, helping with anything that's needed during the conference. Please do enjoy the day. We have an interesting program ahead of us, which I would like to introduce now. We will start with 1 keynote presentation, and then we will have 2 panel discussions with a break in the middle. And again, like the days before, we have presentations of similar or related projects ahead of us. And an informal exchange will be possible at the very end of the day. Or again, facilitated by the project manager of the resourcing project, Alexander Graf. So let's get into the topic of today. Circular economy is the topic of today. And I'm glad to again be able to welcome an absolute expert on this topic who will facilitate the next almost 2 hours for you and ask the right questions, I suppose. May I introduce Matthias Schluep. Matthias Schluep is Managing Director of the World Resources Forum Association. He is leading the association's activities related to mining, secondary raw materials, and global resource policy. And among many others, Matthias is also responsible for the development of multi-stakeholder networks and the facilitation of global stakeholder processes to enhance the international cooperation on raw material policies, investments, and standardization. Matthias has been a key partner for other coordination support actions of the Horizon 2020 program, and is also responsible for several cooperation projects with developing countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. We're very glad to have him here right from Switzerland, and he will be your facilitator for the next speeches and discussions. Matthias, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ursula, and welcome everybody to this conference. We actually at the World Resources Forum, we had our own conference about a month ago, and these topics of primary mining, secondary resources, recycling and circular economy were at the heart of our conference as well. And we realized that, these topics, they have to merge much better. And here we're talking about responsible sourcing. And of course, circular economy and secondary resources, they have a quite great impact on, or the other way around, vice versa, on responsible sourcing. Circular economy is a tool to close or narrow the loop for the product life cycle and to decouple economic activities from primary resource consumptions. And of course, the recycling issue is probably more the traditional issue, which also addresses this. At the same time, responsible sourcing has not really arrived at the discourse of circular economy, and responsible sourcing probably was also not so close or not so intensively discussed in the topic of sourcing of secondary materials. So this session will try to connect the dots between these topics of responsible sourcing, circular economy, and secondary raw materials. We will have an introduction presentation, which I will just announce shortly after this. And then we will have two panels and one on how to improve responsible sourcing in secondary raw materials value chain, where we will focus on secondary raw materials. And in the second, what is the responsibility of value chain actors to improve circularity for raw material flows. So the tough task to actually start this discourse and try to connect these dots has Matthias Buchert from Öko-Institut. He will give us an input presentation. Dr. Matthias Buchert is head of the Resource and Transport Division and has many years of experience in the area of resource efficiency, recycling, precious and metals, recycling of precious and special metals, scenarios and life cycle assessment. Current research focus include work on the demand and supply of raw materials in the electromobility sector. Examples include the project strategies for the sustainable supply of raw materials for electromobility, for Agora Verkehrswende, and the work resource consumption of the passenger vehicle sector in Germany until 2035. The impact of different drive systems on behalf of the Federal Ministry for the Environment. So I invite Matthias to give us some insight into these topics of responsible sourcing, circular economy, and secondary raw materials. Matthias, it's your floor.
Thank you very much, Matthias, for the introduction. I try to give my best. It's a pleasure for me, ladies and gentlemen, to give you a short keynote on the topic. Please, the next slide. Here you see a short overview about my keynote. First, an introduction, primary versus secondary raw materials. A very short overview about differences and similarities regarding responsible sourcing. The second point, the potential of circular economy, CE. Number three, I dig a little bit deeper, the new EU battery regulation, the proposal, maybe a breakthrough for circular economy. Topic 4, the CE potential for some key raw materials for electromobility as an example. And I will close with some short conclusions. Next slide, please. First, some opinions about the two worlds, primary versus secondary. Are there two worlds, raw materials? The differences and maybe the similarities regarding responsible sourcing. First, the primary raw materials. We should think that very often mining activities are often burdened by colonial heritage and other problems. The Democratic Republic of Congo is just one of many examples for this, with all the consequences like lack of governance, corruption issues, artisanal and small-scale mining, lack of any standards, etc., etc. So this is a burden from former centuries, if you like. Furthermore, the mining of metal ores is very often associated with a lot of problems like land destruction, tailing dam disasters, etc., acid mine drainage, and many, many other environmental and health problems. And it's clear, I think, that implementing demanding environmental and social standards is very, very important, but it's a big issue, and it's a hard and a big ball to drill. And without a strict framework, and that's our experience, the good guys, companies who commit to work with good standards are always at an economic disadvantage. This is a key challenge in the overall mining sector. Next slide, please. Now I come to the secondary raw materials. Quite often, you know, the life cycle assessment shows us better environmental performance compared to primary routes. If you compare, for instance, the aluminium production, primary versus secondary, and this is also valid for many, many other metals. But, and this is the other side of the coin, we see very often problems with working conditions and health protection issues in emerging and developing countries. And just one prominent example is the recycling of lead acid batteries in Africa, the problems with heavy metals, etc., toxic issues, and all this stuff. Furthermore, we see in all over the world, also in industrialized countries, like in Germany, deficits in collection rates very often. For example, for electronic waste, portable batteries, etc., etc. So there are a lot of room for improvement, you can say. And this is a similarity. That's the same for the secondary raw materials. Without strict frameworks and rules, the good guys, the same for the primary, like for the secondary raw materials, are always at an economic disadvantage. Next slide, please. What's about recycling? This is from about 10 years ago, from the Global Metal Flows group from the UNEP. Tom Cradle and some colleagues, and I had the honor to be one of them. And we assessed the end-of-life recycling rates, the ranges for about 60 metals. And you see here, there are some blue ones, so that means 50% or even more end-of-life recycling rate, sometimes 80, 90%, sometimes 60%. For some base metals and for some noble metals like platinum, gold, etc., nickel. But you see also many red elements. That means end-of-life recycling rates close to zero or even zero. Yeah, that's valid for rare earth elements, lithium, gallium, etc., and some other mainly technology elements. That was the situation 10 years ago. There might be some improvements, of course, but in an overall context, this slide is still valid. Please, the next one. A little bit about the potential of circular economy, a first slide. For base metals, and of course also for steel, base metals like aluminium, copper, and some others, we see already today major recycling infrastructures. And the potential, the recycling potential will continue to increase in the medium to long term due to the increasing stock of the metals embedded in the troposphere. You see here from a project some years ago, two cake figures, Germany 2014 and Germany 2015 for 5 non-ferrous metals: aluminium, copper, nickel, lead, and zinc. And stock in 2014 in Germany is about 950 tons per capita. And for these 5 metals together, and our projections, and this is backed by experts from the associated industries, we assume that their stock will increase in 30 years, 35 years, to more than 1,600 tons. So that means on the other side, emerging potential for secondary raw materials in the future. And there are many predictions, for instance, for the steel industry. Currently, for steel, the global recycled content is about 40%. And maybe this will increase in 50, 60, 70 years to about 70% or something like that. So it's increasing potential in the medium and long term. Please, the next slide. But for many technology metals, such as the previous mentioned rare earth elements, lithium, indium, gallium, and a couple of others, the potential has yet to be tapped. Yeah, we need appropriate collection systems. They must be introduced or at least optimized. For instance, for the recovery, and this is just an example of lithium compounds from batteries or rare earth elements from permanent magnets, the recycling technologies need to be improved and has to be industrially implemented. And it's very, very important that we get good framework conditions be set by the legislators to create a level playing field here for this new recycling universe for these technology metals. The next slide, please. I'd like to introduce the proposal of the European Commission to the EU battery regulation. We think that could be a breakthrough for circular economy. Why? It would be a milestone in our opinion, and an important building block of the overall European Green Deal. It's interesting for us to notice that the rapidly increasing market ramp of electromobility and the related industrial policy of the European Union, the gigafactories for battery cells, you know, this phrase, the battery Airbus for Europe, etc., provides a new strategic perspective. Such a regulation is not just about waste, but about optimizing the entire life cycle of batteries. That's a new perspective, a safe and a responsible supply of raw materials, as well as support of the EU climate goals. So it's a more comprehensive approach. Next slide, please. I just pick up some key points from the proposal. It's just a few of them. The measure number 1 proposed, the recycling tackles the recycling efficiencies and specific recovery rates for lithium-ion batteries, enhancing the recycling efficiencies. But for us, most important to propose specific recovery rates for key elements like nickel, cobalt, copper, 90% recovery rate for the year 2025, and even 95 2030 for lithium, at least 35% 2025, and at least 70% in 2030. So that would be a very important framework to support the recycling companies and all the stakeholders to invest in good technologies and a good recycling infrastructure. As mentioned before, also CO2 footprint obligations for industrial and EV batteries are proposed. Next slide, please. Again, very interesting proposal to set up secondary metal contents in industrial EV and starter batteries. For instance, for lithium-ion batteries, for new batteries, the share of secondary lithium 4% in 2030, 10% 2035, and for cobalt even higher percentage. That might be, seems to be quite low, but you should notice that the recycling of lithium-ion batteries feed into a very steep growing market. So this would be the starting point to achieve higher recycling potentials in the future for these metals. And last but not least, measure number 13, mandatory due diligence for industrial and EV batteries for the raw materials. That would be also an important cornerstone of this new regulation. Next slide, please. I'd like to show you some slides, some results of a former project we finished a few years ago, the Fab4Lip project funded by the German Ministry for Research. And we compared two global scenarios for mobility, an ambitious scenario regarding the growth of e-mobility and a more conservative one. And please, the next slide. Of course, there are many scenarios available for mobility. We choose the IEA 2017 scenarios. There is a 2DS, that means two degrees scenario for the change of the global average temperature, and the B2DS scenario, that's a more ambitious, that's beyond 2 degrees, so better than a 2 degrees scenario. Next slide, please. Here, just an impression, what does it mean? This is just for the beyond 2 degrees scenario for the passenger vehicle sales. That's the left, the columns, and right, the stock development of the global passenger car fleet. We start 2016. Almost all the cars are equipped with an internal combustion engine. That means diesel and gas. Then we see growth of other types like hybrid vehicles, plug-in, battery electric vehicles or full electric vehicles, and maybe some fuel cell vehicles. You see, following this scenario until 2050, drastic transformation of this sector to e-mobility, and you see the result in the stock graph on the right side. Please, next slide. This would be the translation into the necessary gigawatt hour production per year for lithium-ion batteries. And of course, in the more ambitious beyond 2 degrees scenario, we see a tremendous growth of necessary gigawatt hour battery capacities. And you see also the red part of the columns that most of the battery capacity is necessary for the passenger car subsector. Please, the next slide. Thank you. This would be the result after following this scenario for the lithium demand for the global e-mobility, for trucks, for passenger cars, and etc., etc. The red column is the total primary production, global primary production of lithium in the year 2019. It's about 86,000 tons. And the yellow colors are the respective demand of lithium for the global mobility sector. And you see, of course, that's not a surprise, remarkable, a significant growth for the lithium demand. And you see the light yellow part of the yellow columns are the potential recycling contribution from secondary lithium, from the recycling from lithium-ion batteries. It starts here with about 10% in 2030, and it could achieve maybe 40% of the recycled content for new batteries in the year 2050. And we have the experience from other technologies like the platinum group metals for automotive catalysts. And if you look back 30 years ago, it would be a similar picture. And now the recycling of platinum group metals from automotive catalysts are an important source for platinum group metals for new catalysts or for maybe fuel cells or other applications. Thank you. Next slide, please. A similar picture for cobalt. We start with a primary production in 2019, 140,000. 2016, just a few thousand tons for the global mobility sector. Of course, it's increasing very fast following steep growth of e-mobility globally. And you see in the year 2050, secondary raw material, in this case cobalt, could contribute significantly to the overall supply. Next slide, please. Just some conclusions. The great potential of CE is long-term, strategic. It's long-term nature. We are at a starting point. Yeah, you can say sowing must be done today, and the big harvest will come later. But it's important to start now. Yeah, and however, responsible sourcing require clear and binding rules and frameworks. And this applies equally to primary and secondary raw materials. Next slide, please. It's my final statement. In the medium and long term, ambitious CE will play an significantly important role in sustainable raw material supply. But the right course must be set for this now to achieve a good harvest in the future. And the example of the new EU battery regulation is just the first, but a very relevant cornerstone for this. Next slide, please. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Matthias, for this very good introduction. I think that sets the scene for the further panel discussion, but we have time, about 5 minutes, to take a few questions from the audience. And it seems like that the EU battery regulations called the attention of the audience. And there was a first question, where do you see the weaknesses or issues of the current EU battery regulations? You talked about all the issues it addresses and that this is a very important first step. Do you also see weaknesses in these EU battery regulations?
Do you mean weaknesses in the proposal for the new regulation?
Yeah, in the proposal, obviously.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think there are many weaknesses. Maybe, of course, there is always room for improvement, and in the detail, there is still homework to do. We currently working again for the Commission to do this homework. Yeah. But I don't see many really weak points in this regulation. Yeah. But nevertheless, it's easy to write down a regulation. The harder task is to implement it, yeah, and to control that the obligations are fulfilled, etc. But I'd like to raise an important point. This is a regulation. That means it would be valid immediately for the EU 27. Yeah, as you know best, the current battery directive, or usually the directives, has to be translated in national laws in every member state, and this is a very lasting and not very convincing approach. So to set a regulation valid for the whole block would be a big achievement.
Okay, maybe that leads to the other question. I mean, it's of course it's a regulation for the European Commission for Europe, no, the European Communion. Now, how will this EU battery regulation impact non-EU countries? I mean, you said it's a quite ambitious to domesticate this in the EU. Now, what's the impact on our trade partners, on other parts in the world?
Yes, we know from the past that regulations, frameworks of the European Union had an impact also on countries abroad Europe. First, the obligations on due diligence that is valid for all actors all over the world to fulfill the obligations. Second, also the CO2 obligations, and also the obligations for the recycled content. That's examples that some of the obligations of the new battery regulation would impact also stakeholders outside Europe. And we know that good regulations in Europe, partly at least copied by other countries to set up regulations in their countries.
Okay, thank you. Then there's another add-on question. Will nickel play a relevant role short to medium term as a substitute for cobalt in batteries?
Yeah, of course. Nickel, of course, we have results for nickel too, and the demand for nickel is, of course, increasing significantly due to the global growth of e-mobility, but also because cobalt is substituted by nickel. Yeah, so you have a double impact. Yeah, so the nickel demand is significantly increasing. Yeah, that's a challenge. That's no doubt about it.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Matthias. I think that leads quite nicely over also with the international view, nicely over to the next panel. And I would like to switch. Thank you very much, Matthias. I would like to switch to our panel. The topic is responsible sourcing in global secondary resource streams. Current challenges is how to address them. And what I would like to do, I would like to introduce one panel speaker by each other and give each of them a quick chance for an intro statement. And the intro statement is also to introduce the different views on this topic from the different panel members on their top 2 issues in international secondary raw material streams most urgently to be addressed in order to improve responsible sourcing of secondary raw materials. I start actually with my colleague, Sonia Valdivia. She is the scientific director at the World Resources Forum and active in the area of sustainable recycling industries and life cycle sustainability management. She is convener of the ISO Joint Working Group 14 for the standards 59014. The number is not so important, but it's a standard on secondary materials, which is co-developed between 2 ISO technical committees. And she's also steering committee member of the Life Cycle Initiative hosted by UNEP and a professor at the University of Leufena in Lüneburg. She is a former UNEP program officer at the Division of Technology, Industry and Economics, and has been coordinating the secretariat of the UNEP CTEC Life Cycle Initiative. So Sonia, I would like to give you the opportunity to focus on your 2 top issues in international secondary raw material streams. Yes. In conjunction with responsible sourcing, of course. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Matthias. As it was introduced, well, thank you also the organizers, and it's my pleasure to be in front of this very nice audience. On the intro statements, I mean, from my perspective, from the perspective that I represent, that is the standardization initiatives, the work that is going on, that has been done so far. I would like to focus on the need to better understand what is the value chain really about. What materials are we talking about? Who are behind in the handling, in the processing? How much of this is flowing through the value chain, and where especially is happening? All these lead us to an information system, to a platform, to a system that allow us to understand these sometimes hidden flows. And this is where we're coming from. From the standardization work, what we try is to provide and identify the elements that are critical to know in order to ensure a credible traceability. And that is the only way that we can, then develop measures for solving key issues in countries, locally, but also internationally, but also pointing out to opportunities. So to me, the information system, to ensure, to increase the credibility of the traceability of these material flows is essential for secondary materials. And this, of course, needs the shared responsibility of the actors that could take part in this. So there are 2 elements, the traceability and shared responsibility. And this is something that is tackled with in the standardization work, and that will, I think, be able to explain, to detail in the next moments when we have the interventions along the questions.
Okay, thank you, Sonia. A clear statement for a comprehensive view on the whole value chain and all the actors in the value chain. Now I would like to lead over to Tatiana Terikova. She actually, I think she also comes from the world of the whole value chain because she represents the Basel Convention. Tatiana Terikova has a leading role in the partnership program engagement with non-state actors and illegal traffic and trade of hazardous chemicals waste under the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Convention. Tatiana implements a number of capacity building activities, including in the relation to marine pollution, plastic wastes. She deals with the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular its indicators and governance issues of the Basel and Stockholm Convention's regional centers. Prior to this function, she was coordinating capacity building activities for the implementation of the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions, including the E-Waste Africa program. So also another expert from a little bit a different view. So Tatiana, what are your two top issues related to responsible sources and secondary raw materials and the material flows in general?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Matthias, and it is my pleasure to be part of this panel discussion. And I will bring to the table the perspective of the UN and multilateral environmental agreements, and in particular the Basel Convention, which deals with hazardous and other waste, and the Stockholm Convention, which serves to curb or ban the production and use of some most toxic chemicals, the so-called persistent organic pollutants, the POPs. So and that, of course, this is important in the context of the circular economy and sustainable consumption and production. And in fact, circular economy is very much embraces the waste hierarchy, which is a backbone of the Basel Convention, where parties take a commitment to prevent, minimize generation of waste, as well as to reuse, repair, recycle, and recover resources for its environmentally sound management. And and in fact, in the framework of the Basel Convention, we already have some examples where some waste streams, for example, e-waste and plastic waste, provide some promising promising examples to demonstrate how the circular economy can be implemented on the ground. So from that perspective, the first issue which I would like to highlight here is that the importance of consideration when it comes to the international trade in hazardous and other waste. So as you know, the Basel Convention does provide protection for developing countries from unwanted waste, which they cannot safely manage in order to protect the environment and human health. And in case when this waste are traded not respecting the rules of the convention, then we're talking about illegal activities, illegal traffic, and which needs to be punished as a criminal offense. So from that perspective, we need to keep in mind that when it comes to the international trade of hazard and other waste, this illegal traffic needs to be prevented and combated, as well as countries need to carefully consider what type of waste they should allow into the countries to ensure the environmentally sound management. And here you have some considerations. For example, sometimes countries are importing some waste as a raw material for the recycling industry, as a second-hand goods, and sometimes you have some let's say gray zones where it's difficult to distinguish whether it's waste or products, and a lot of attention needs to be put there. So that's my first question, to really my first point, to really pay attention to, let's say, to facilitate the legal trade, but also to combat and prevent illegal trade. And then the second point is that it's important to remember that the circularity is not absolute. And in some cases, it might be not the most suitable solution. And that is in particular true when it comes to POPs, which are highly toxic chemicals. And example of POPs, which are, for example, we often discuss in the context of the circular economy, include some flame retardants, and some of them, they are regulated by the Stockholm Convention. So, but that means that, however, also in some cases, parties in some cases there can be exemptions. So meaning that, for example, if there is no suitable and safe alternatives to certain chemicals, then parties can produce and use pulps even though they're, let's say, banned at the international level. So but that leads me to the point that recycling of materials, of products containing pulps need to be taken with a caution to maintain the credibility and safety in the context of the circular economy, and also to make sure and also to make sure that reputation of the recycling itself remains untouched. So these are the two main issues I would like to highlight.
Okay, thank you, Tatiana. So I think quite clear, you pointed towards the trade issues, and I think a very interesting notion towards the end of your intervention was also maybe that the circular economy or recycling, we don't want to keep everything circular, no? We don't want to keep everything in the loop. There are certain things we want to get out of the loop. I think this could be interesting for the discussion as well, because this is always connected to others. So we have now talking of trade, and we heard, that along the trade there are differences in technology capabilities and in sustainability connected to that, how we actually recover secondary raw materials, which probably then leads us to these responsible sourcing issues. And I think we have another expert who is very much focused on that since many years. That's Susan Carcher. Susan Carcher, she's running her own consultancy company in South Africa since many, many years, focusing on waste management, but also decided a few years ago that waste management is part of the old linear world thinking, and decided to found or co-found together with others ACE in the African Circular Economy Network, I think, which also really is very interesting now for this discussion to have this view from Africa, South Africa. Susan, what are you, as an intro statement, your two key issues related to this topic? You have to unmute yourself, Susan.
I just saw, sorry. Good day, everyone. For me, it's an interesting situation being European. As you can hear, I'm German, but I live in South Africa since 1996. So I have this really interesting opportunity to look really at both sides of the deal, so to speak, and to get a sense of where people are coming from. And, to reflect what Matthias Buchert was already pointing out, using the example of the DRC. If there is no social justice and if there's no human development coming with the sourcing of secondary materials, or primary for that matter, it's not really a deal for Africa. I think what we need to see in Africa is really that we get more emphasis and opportunity afforded on the value-adding and skill-building components that could come, the job-creating activities that could be linked to, providing those secondary resources. Just much more higher value activities. I would like to see that. I know this discussion is about secondary resources. I will not detract, but there's also something like secondary functionality. And Tatiana, you alluded to this already, the higher loops, the remanufacturing, the refurbishment, the repair. I really would like to see Africa become an ultimate hub of knowledge that is actually complementing the efficient provision of secondary resources, because functionality is higher, but we never talk about the need of maintaining the useful life. And I think that is crucial in the debate as well.
Okay, thank you, Susan. So that's a voice from Africa. Although you just said you're originally German, but I know that you actually talk very much for Africa, and you're very African.
Very much for Africa now.
So then, last but not least, we have Luca Marmo from the European Commission. He is with the European Commission since 1997 and has since worked on a variety of policy and legislative files in the Environment Directorate General. including organic waste management, soil protection, and bilateral relations between the EU, India, Indonesia, Southeast Asian nations. Since July 2016, Luke has been working on the international aspects of sustainable consumption and production, resource efficiency and circular economy, including the International Resource Panel and the Global Alliance on Circular Economy and Resource Efficiency. So this is really at the core of the discussions we have in this panel and also the panel to follow. He is also the G7 T20 coordinator for matters of relevance to the Environment and Directorate General. So from your point of view, also a little bit point of view of the European Commission's, what are the two key issues when talking about responsible sourcing and secondary materials?
Thank you, Matthias. Good afternoon to all colleagues, all members of this panel, and to all those who are listening to our chat this afternoon. I think I would make a bit of a general point in terms of the broader sustainability aspects and the role that secondary raw materials can play in this context. The United Nations Secretary General always talks about a triple crisis: climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution as three aspects of unsustainable development that have a bearing on environmental issues, social aspects, and the economy, because all three of them cover the three aspects, have an impact on the three aspects of sustainable development. And if we want to address climate change, we need to make a transition towards more greener economies, or actually make a transition to green economies. And these also imply the use of certain materials, imply the use of secondary raw materials that have a lower carbon footprint in their use. The use of secondary raw materials can also support minimizing impacts on ecosystems, and therefore help halting and reversing biodiversity loss, which is another big problem that the world is facing today. And by reusing, by recycling, by avoiding extraction of primary materials, we can also contribute to minimizing pollution, air pollution in particular, but also of soil or water. So the use certainly of primary, but also of secondary raw materials and the responsible sourcing of them as a key contributor to addressing the triple crisis the world is facing. And the second point I would make, echoing what basically all of those who have spoken before me have already said, the importance that we think the circular economy can play in achieving a more sustainable development in the field of production, and therefore, and also in the context of consumption. So addressing aspects under the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals, including SDG 12 on sustainable consumption and production, which has elements dealing with waste, elements dealing with chemicals, and where resource efficiency and circularity can make a big contribution. There are aspects that have been mentioned in terms of standardization, in terms of trade, in terms of toxic chemicals, in terms of jobs, and so on. But I leave all this for our later discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Luca. Maybe just staying with you, we have also heard from Matthias the introduction presentation. You know, there's a certain potential, and we also have stocks building up for certain raw materials, which then can turn into secondary raw materials. So what is the view of the European Commission of the potential on this? I mean, does this say we can actually switch to more than 50% of secondary raw materials we can source from? Or I mean, how do we get a little bit of feeling of the potential?
Well, when the Commission published the March 2020 Circular Economy Action Plan, it was accompanied by what we call in the jargon a staff working document, so a more technical paper on the international aspects of the circular economy transition at the global level. And in that paper, the point was made that at the moment, the global economy is about 9% circular. And in the EU, maybe we do a bit better, around 12%, but we are a far cry from the real circularity we would like to see. So the potential is big. At the same time, we also made the point that we would still need primary materials, primary raw materials. So the issue is actually to have sustainable sourcing for both, while recognizing that secondary raw materials are playing a role, little at the moment, that should become bigger and bigger. And that's why in our circular economy action plans, we had a number of them. The focus is really on making waste a resource, and while avoiding waste generation wherever possible, also ensuring that there is no waste in the sense of resources, energy, and material wasted, but that are brought back in the circle. For doing that, we need a number of actions, some of which have been mentioned by Sonia, by Tatiana, in particular in terms of chemicals and toxic elements, and I think we can come back on this aspect. So there is potential. The circularity, both in Europe and at the global level, is still very little. Secondary raw materials have a key role to play, although the world will still need the primary materials and responsible sourcing for all of them. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Luca. So if we keep a little bit on this notion of becoming circular, we talk now about the European Union. Of course, we are all globalized, and the European Union is not an entity by itself and closed. You know, there's the international trade, and probably Tatiana knows that now this question comes to her. So of course, to enable circular economy, international trade will play a role. And we already know now that actually we have, when we talk, for example, for waste, which should be recovered in the European Communion, we have what we call leakages in the European Communion. So we have trade of waste or of secondary goods. I mean, sometimes it's also just secondary goods which are traded just like primary goods. I mean, new products are traded. So when we talk about that, what is necessary? What is necessary for international trade that we can talk about, okay, this really supports closing the loops of the circular economy, but it's also responsibly made in the international trade. Tatiana.
Thank you, Matthias. And I think you pointed out to the important notion responsibly, because I think when we talk about this issue at the global level, it adds a lot of complexity. And I think also the fact that, yes, we're talking about circular economy and, for example, international trade and in waste, but I think the devil is in details, in fact. And here you have a quite big differences depending on what type of, for example, even waste streams we're talking about. For example, if we're talking about waste streams which are like e-waste or end-of-use vehicles, there you have some critical materials, you have some critical metals, so it's much more complex. It has both hazardous components and non-hazardous components. But there you have perhaps much more you have some higher, bigger incentives to make sure that you trace the trade, you trace the recycling, and you also perhaps for example, for European Union to keep these critical materials within, right? So, and there is this incentive to to make sure that there is no leakages, there is a good recycling, and so on. Then the situation quite different if we're talking about the plastic waste. It's as you said there, plastic waste doesn't really have silver or gold or anything like that, but it's something which some developed countries, it's quite expensive to do the proper recycling within the country. So there have been a trend to really export that to the developing nations, and there the problem becomes that if such waste are not properly separated, even if they're not hazardous, but they're mixed, they create a huge environmental challenge. So, and for years, plastic waste have been traded as non-hazardous waste, which means outside of the Basel control, meaning that environmental authorities cannot really properly track all the import-exports, and only starting this year, January of this year, there have been changes in the regulation of plastic waste. So now they can be classified either as hazardous if they're mixed, for example, with some hazard materials, non-hazardous if they're destined for recycling, and if they are separated and it's single polymers. Or the third, let's say, classification is if it's a mixed waste, even though they're not hazardous, but because it's so difficult to recycle them if they're not separated, then it's either they're just, let's say, they end up in the uncontrolled landfill and they pollute the environment, and also thinking about the additives which are part of that, So all of that means that indeed, it's tricky nowadays to talk about, strictly speaking, hazardous, non-hazardous, which is the Basel Convention is based on that, and that philosophy. But also you have this other type of waste which are difficult to recycle, and there I think the countries can benefit from the opportunities under the Basel Convention to actually produce some additional restrictions. And if they do so, then other countries have to respect these restrictions, and they cannot really export such waste to these countries. So in a way, it all leads us to the whole, let's say, issue between environmental trade. It's an old issue, but it's a little bit, yes. So from the environmental point of view, at least in the context of the Basel Convention, countries can produce or restrictions and bans and so on. But from the trade point of view, there is this talk about that, let's say, trade facilitation and bans are considered to be as a barriers. So there should be less barriers. So it's quite interesting, I think, this two different perspectives. But I think, for example, at least for the in the area of plastic waste, there have been a lot of discussions with WTO, with the trade partners, and they also the trade, let's say, forum are starting to embrace the circular economy concept and so on. So, and I think we do need this type of broader policy discussions to really make sure that we don't stop trade, but we also make sure that developing countries are not overwhelmed with unwanted waste.
Okay, thank you. So it's also a clear vote to actually stronger enforce the tools we have available, such like the Basel Convention, to ensure that this is actually done responsibly. And this maybe gives is a good starting point also to ask or to give a question to Africa, to Susan. Is this, when we talk about, I mean, you receive waste, or you also you said a strong vote also, you want to develop your tools and your capacities in Africa. I mean, is this the only thing which we have available to ensure that we have a responsible trade, and which leads then to responsible sourcing, or are there other elements you would add here and say this is for me part of, let's say, the Western production system or the international trade, that we can ensure responsible sourcing from our point of view?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, look, I mean, Tatiana, you alluded to it, this Basel Convention is a good example, as it's a double-sided sword, because I do think there's a great potential as well, and to really have a hard look and saying, where's the value add? And, if you just look at the demographics, in Africa, we have a lot of people. We are looking for opportunities for human development. So I'm a big fan of the best of both worlds kind of model, which is really saying, okay, can we just look at in the value chain, what is the best of both worlds? Where are our respective strengths? Where are our weaknesses? So I don't mind if the secondary resources come to Africa in the form of e-waste, because that's what happens, okay? And but we need systems that make sure that we're not cherry picking. And I think that is the problem at the moment. People take out the stuff that is financially viable and it leaves the rest behind. So what I think is really, really important is that we're really pushing for extended producer responsibility, that we are not getting like secondhand services. And interesting enough, there is now a discussion right now going on coming from Nigeria and the Copernicus Institute in the Netherlands to talk about an ultimate producer responsibility, which would actually take things a step further and say, in order to make sure that things are responsibly treated in developing countries and not just, the nice secondary resources recovered, what we would need is a financial transfer mechanisms from EU-based EPR programs. Basically, that under the EUV directive, we can actually find finances and develop a financial mechanism that can source those funds to make sure that EPR is done responsibly inside and outside of Europe. That would help already a great deal, I think. That's one of the key things that I really feel that is important, that we ring fence that kind of money, and that Europe looks beyond just EPR. We need to literally be also elevated on the same protection level as the WE directive. And unfortunately, we still see a lot of evidence that wherever are legal loopholes, this is where we can also see there's no enforcement. We see gross human rights violations by people extracting secondary resources. There are middlemen that actually, utilize the fact that the informal sector can't reach the recyclers. And the one thing that is also not sitting well with Africa, obviously, is we don't have any end processing capacity, or very little end processing capacity of our own. So all the dirty work, in terms of recovering the secondary materials is done in Africa, and then it all goes over to Europe because we don't have end processing facilities. So we do the cherry picking and we are left with the waste. I know this is a bit provocative, but I think, this is the realities as well. So whatever deal comes, it must really take into account the non-viable fractions, and that the non-viable fractions are also taken care of as part of the deal agreement. And it must form an intrinsic part of the business model. So if we talk about what is the business model of sourcing secondary resources from Africa, it must be costed in. It cannot remain an externalized cost.
Now, just as a clarification, Susan, I mean, are you talking about ring fencing the financing systems in Europe? And is that not against that actually also in Africa, you should build up the system and take the responsibility? Now we lost your voice, Susan. Susan, I think you have muted yourself.
Sorry, I think I'm getting automatically I'm muted when I'm getting too excited. No, but that perhaps is the wrong word, the terms ring fencing, but to make sure that the EPR obligations and that the extent of EPR obligations that in Europe also sets the pace of protecting people from the negatives of secondary resources is actually transferred also into developing countries. That's what I mean.
Okay. Okay, well, in the end, it's actually the ones who sources the secondary materials, no, who also can have a handle or have an impact on that. And that leads me to the next questions. I mean, that's the responsibility of the actors who actually are accessing the secondary resources. And there are systems, I mean, you can have a governmental imposed system by law, or you also can have voluntary system, which leads me a little bit to this world of standardization and best practice, which are applied also on a voluntary basis. This is a question for Sonia because she's working in this area with ISO together. So what is the potential and what are the issues related to this? I think you also need to unmute yourself.
Oh, okay. This is definitely an emerging topic of interest worldwide. We see that from different angles, from different stakeholder groups and audiences, there is a demand for guidance and for tools, for frameworks and harmonized frameworks in order to trade properly. The opportunity is there. I am extremely happy about now, as said, the momentum that we experience. But of course, there is a long run still until we finalize some of our work, and this is because operators, companies, industrial associations, but also governments need the guidance on how to move forward in a responsible way. This responsibility, the shared responsibility, is a key principle in the standards. This started with ISO 26000, maybe in a more general way, but now it's anchored in a very concrete way in a number of approaches that are emerging. The ISO that we are developing on secondary materials is based on that shared responsibility. We have other principles that are, of course, so important and very much also very new to us, probably the focus on subsistence activities, on the informal sector, because this is where we are acknowledging the reality of global value chains. We cannot talk nowadays that value chains are local. We could say almost 100% of value chains. And in terms of quantities of volumes of products and materials handled, have international sources, are not locally sourced. So therefore, this informal sector is becoming very, very important to be tackled with. And these, as you may understand, as we know, are happening mostly in vulnerable regions, in developing countries. So this is now accepted, and in 1 decade before, 10 years ago, wouldn't have been possible, perhaps, because we still think everything needs to be legal. But we have to acknowledge the role of the ones that are doing the job, although not having a legal entity, but are properly working on solving the recycling, collection, and some activities along the value chain of the secondary resource. So there is an opportunity, there is work done there, and this will support the trade, definitely. And in the trade, again, if we don't have these requirements well settled, definitions clearly on the table, these harmonized system codes where we can differentiate what is waste, what is not waste. By the way, we now call them recoverable resources. We are changing our mindsets. We try to avoid the term waste because this is exactly what we want, where we want to go, to find the recoverable source notion in everything that is in our world, in our lives. I think this is the movement, the trend, and other standards are emerging, of course, local ones. The adoption of international standards are now happening at the local level, which is extremely important as well. I think this is the direction, the right direction, in order to support these frameworks' needs everywhere.
Okay, thank you. Now, we heard about the needs of Africa. We also heard the tools of the Basel Convention for International Trade, and also of actually ISO is an industry focused initiative. Now, coming back to you, Luca, what are policies and tools in place by the European Commission to mitigate risks of negative impacts through international secondary resource streams? Apart, of course, from supporting Basel Convention, etc.
Yes, we are a big fan of the Basel Convention and of multilateral environmental agreements in general. I would like to say a few things. The first is in the Circular Economy Action Plan of last March. The Commission said that we should work to avoid that we export the waste challenge to other countries. So we didn't say that we want to block the export of waste, but certainly that we would look into avoiding that what maybe is shipped as recyclable material in reality is just waste that cannot be recycled and then ends up in the environment of an African, Asian, or Latin American country. So there is that work ongoing. Basel is part of the picture. We have our own shipment regulation for waste, and it's something that we are considering for a number of waste streams in particular. Last month, 3 weeks ago, the Commission adopted a strategy on, wait, I'll tell you the title because I have it in front of me, Chemical Strategy for Sustainability Towards a Toxic-Free Environment. And there is a section dedicated in particular to secondary raw materials, where we are making the point that I think Tatiana was making earlier, that we want a circular economy, but we don't want to circulate back pollutants. So two ways in which we want to achieve a toxic-free circular economy is the first one, looking at the design phase. We want to design out waste, certainly, but we will also want to design out toxic chemicals to avoid that then there is later on an impact when the product is used, but also when the product ends its life and has to be dealt with to avoid impacts when it is disposed or recycled and so on. So first, upstream, which of course will take some time to get get legislated and then having an impact on the ground. The second part of a toxic-free circular economy is to look at chemicals that are already out there. And so while in principle, we should avoid that these toxic chemicals enter into the economic cycle again, exception can be made if one can be sure that there is a way of avoiding that these toxic chemicals do have an impact on the environment or on human health. So looking at this toxicity aspect as an important enabler element for the circular economy, in particular on secondary raw materials. Another aspect that I think Sonia mentioned in her first intervention, the issue of information. We are working also on what we call a sustainable product initiative that would look, among other things, on how to ensure that information about the composition of a product is passed on along the value chain so that the final user can be informed, properly informed of origin, impacts of the components of a given product. And this is an important element also in terms of consumer awareness. The third point I would make, and is going back to something that Suzanne said earlier, the aspects of jobs. And I was digging some figures in terms of what can be the impact of going more circular, and so having a thriving, clean, but thriving secondary raw material market. So for every 10,000 tons of waste generated in a year, if they are incinerated or landfilled, they would generate 2 jobs. If we go towards remanufacturing of some of these waste, the job generation is about 55. Recycling is 115. And if we go for repairing, for what can be repaired, and therefore then reuse, we go to more than 400. So the job opportunities of moving away from the waste frame, but going towards value retention processes such as remanufacturing, refurbishment, and repair is huge. And this is an important element for developed economies, but also for developing economies. I'll also have a point on extended producer responsibility, but I leave it for a possible next intervention. Thanks.
Yeah, actually, that gives this notion again, that responsible sourcing of secondary materials in the first place would be actually being responsible is that the secondary materials don't have to be produced. They stay with the function, or they stay with a product. I don't know if anybody of you wants to add something on that.
I can just add that I found a statistic from Walter Stahel, who is obviously one of the godfathers of the circular economy. And he found out, if you look at the ratio of man hours versus the kilograms of resources, if you compare the manufacturing of the engine with virgin material versus remanufacturing that engine, the ratio is 270 to 1 in terms of human hours. So, for us, the answer in Africa clearly lies in the value add, lies in the activities that can add the human hours in terms of what Africa is doing to be part of the value chain as the partner, as a useful partner in the value chain.
Yeah, that also gives me actually a good point. I saw one question, a provocative question in the chat. There's a person who said it's totally clear. We have to close the loop of the materials flow. It's important, otherwise we don't reach the targets, which are also discussed in the COP26 now. That's an addition from myself. However, and this is the notion that we're still consuming a lot, and there is some discussion and some hidden criticism maybe also for the European Commission, that by all the activities of circular economy and the concepts and the tools we are also hiding, we tend to hide that we are not on the path to reach our goals and actually address this issue. Is there anything you can say on this, Luca, or also the other ones are free to add on this?
Well, I would say that if you look at the first page in the Circular Economy Action Plan that the Commission adopted in March 2020, it says that if we were to continue consuming resources at the same pace, we would need 2 or 3 planet Earths. So the recognition that current economic development is unsustainable is part of that Circular Economy Action Plan, but comes from the European Green Deal, which is the big blueprint for action at European level for the current Commission. And the work we are doing is, when we talk about circular economy, we do not only mean just keeping the circle going. We also talk about avoidance, prevention, reduction, phasing out. We also talk, for example, if we look at the plastics domain, in record time in 2019, the Commission proposed, and then Council and Parliament adopted specific legislation on single-use products and fishing gear. And some of those single-use products have been banned. So we've said we don't want plastic cups or cutlery made of plastics and so on anymore, because these has an impact in terms of littering, particularly the oceans, but also because it's a waste of resources. That is oil. That is carbon dioxide that goes up in the atmosphere for a use of a few seconds and then is thrown away. So the dimension of reduction is also present in our discourse. And that's, I think, is also the reason why when we bring the circular economy concept in a multilateral context, not all countries subscribe to it, because there is this element that is also part of our action in terms of prevention, in terms of reduction, that not all countries like.
Okay, thank you. Now we have a few minutes left, and I would just want to give you a chance to actually highlight one key message, but that means you have to concentrate on 1 or 2 sentences the most, because otherwise we're running over the time. And Susan, what's your key message out of these panels you would like to address?
I think at the heart lies new trade agreements. The current trade agreements are too linear, they are socially unjust. They need to incorporate the entire value chain, the last end mile. They need to show what the informal sector contributes to the bigger picture. And rather measure in Gini rather than the GDP, because in Africa, GDP means nothing as an economic indicator. Gini index, inequity of wealth, will tell you how just a transition is. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Sonia, what would be your key message?
Yeah, thanks, Matthias. Yeah, I think this discussion on the last question also made me think of the criticism that we acknowledge there is on circular economy. We already talked about the human dimension that is missing, that it should be strengthened. By the way, in ISO, we are working on that. It's considering the socioeconomic aspects that should be part of circular economy, the circular economy framework. So we are trying, but of course not a regulatory framework yet. And another point is now going beyond, because that is important, the sustainable consumption aspect. We don't tackle this because this is beyond this discussion. I think maybe if we try to also engage with this discourse of sustainable consumption, we could have a more stable and robust circular economy approach, where we really also reduce the inputs and the materials that are at the end of the day in this cycle. So these are my key points. Closing
Thank you, Sonia. Tatiana.
Thank you, Matthias. And I think my point is linked to what Sonia was just saying, as well as Luca and Susan. So I think for this discussion, for me, each stakeholder group has something to contribute to that. So when we're talking about overconsumption, here you have consumers, individual choices. Also have the role for the private sector to design products which last longer and more durable. Then you have the governments which are responsible to produce policies which encourage some behaviors and maybe alternative products and things like that. And then of course NGO groups to support this movement, and academia to provide to make informed choices and to make sure that decision makers can make informed decisions. So there is really, it's a puzzle, and each of us and each stakeholder group have to be part of the puzzle.
Okay, thanks. Luca, final word.
All of the above. And I would just add one thing in terms of extended producer responsibility and in general market-based instruments. I think we have been using them in the EU and in OECD countries, and we should try to use them even more, particularly in developing countries, because through extended producer responsibility schemes, it's a way of responsibilizing producers in terms of waste prevention and avoidance, but also giving a message to citizens. Because EPR works if you have separate collection, basically. And separate collection means that everyone is aware of the waste he or she produces, and therefore can take action also in terms of the prevention aspects and reduction we have been discussing, and the question in the chat alluded to. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So this was a very nice closing words, and you all pointed out to kind of the obvious, no? Responsible sourcing has something to do with responsibility. So we have to take our responsibility. And with this, I give back to Ursula for closing this first panel. Thank you all.
Thank you. I also want to thank you all for participating in this very interesting first panel discussion. And we will continue later, but let's have a quick break. And before we go into the break, I would kindly ask you, if you have a couple of minutes, could you fill in the survey? We have it on the conference website. There is a small survey. It would help us to develop our work. And if you are a registered user, you can always go to this resource session and even watch discussions and speeches later, because they will stay there for a while for you. Let me announce a break. We will get back at 3:45 Central European time with the second part of this part of the discussion with producer responsibility. So please do enjoy your break and see you soon. Stay with us. Bye-bye. Welcome back, everybody, to the second part of the session on circular economy. There is a panel discussion ahead of us on producer responsibility. And this will be facilitated again by Matthias Schlueb. He's managing director of the World Resource Forum Association, and he's leading the association's activities related to mining, secondary raw materials, and global resource policy. Amongst others, Matthias is also responsible for the development of multi-stakeholder networks and the facilitation of global stakeholder processes to enhance the international cooperation on raw material policies, investments, and standardizations. Here with us from Switzerland, the floor is yours, Matthias, to introduce your panelists.
Thank you, Ursula. I just want to look back a little bit. We just come out of a very interesting panel where we were looking on responsible sourcing for secondary raw materials, which is of course connected to this panel. And there were two things which were quite apparent for me coming out of this panel. One thing, that you cannot really discuss responsible sourcing for secondary materials without looking at the broader picture, especially that responsibility is well connected to a broader sense that just responsible sourcing, also including, of course, and that was very much a focus on circular economy. And the second thing is that, yeah, it's the obvious that responsible sourcing is directly connected to responsibility. And there was a panel more, I would say, on a policy level, and now our next panel is a practical panel, because of course we can talk about policies and approaches, but in the end it's the ones who have to implement these policies on the bottom or on the practical side. And I would say, and that leads me to the panelists, I would say that our panelists, they're actually coming from the practical side, and with them we would like to discuss more the possibilities or the responsibilities of the producers or other actors which are more on the practical side of responsible sourcing of secondary raw materials, and also responsibility connected to circular economy. And I would like to do this exactly the same way like in the first panel. I would like to introduce one by one of our panelists and give them a chance to focus on an interest statement, and the interest statement would be what is feasible in terms of responsibly sourcing secondary raw materials. Where are the limits? How do you implement these practices? I think that's very interesting to hear from each of you. You all, as you will hear, each of the panelists represents a little bit different part of the value chain. I would like to start with Pascal Leroy. Pascal has worked for Aplia, the EU household appliance and manufacturing industry from 2000 to 2007, and for the WE Forum since 2007. So he's there, the Director General of the WE Forum, and he's an expert in communication on complex supranational environmental policies and projects affecting the electrical and electronic equipment value chain, from mining over manufacturing and use of recycling, and of course with a very strong focus also on the take-back schemes. So please, Pascal, what would be your intro statement?
My introductory statement would be that we should not lose sight of the challenges in front of us. They are really daunting. The material footprint of the European Union is enormous. It's 14.5 per capita, tons per capita. And really, we have to keep this in mind. And as we have heard from Matthias Buchert, there's a lot that remains to be done. And for example, the recycling, there's a huge recycling potential that is untapped at this very minute. It's really minimal if you compare to what is possible going forward. And Matthias Buchert was showing that by the year 2050, approximately 40% of 40% of demand can be met by recycling. Today, as I said, it's just a few percentages. And the European Union is totally dependent on certain countries for sourcing of its materials, and recycling plays a very limited role. Matthias Buchert showed the Mendeleev's table, and almost all the boxes were red, meaning that many of these materials, many of these elements, we recycle on less than 1%. Some of them is less than 2%, some 5%. But all in all, recycling is extremely low for these, for the base metals, for the valuable metals, for the critical raw materials. And so that is a reason also why the European Union identified a list of what they called critical raw materials. So it's not just a fluffy term, it's a legal term, meaning that these are materials that are extremely important for the European economy, but the supply of which is risky because they are because certain countries dominate the supply, and it's especially a problem for rare earth elements, which we need for the energy transition, for decarbonization, for windmills, and so forth. But it's also for other materials such as nickel and cobalt and so forth. And so I think this has to be the focus going forward. There's a lot that the sector can do. Of course, first and foremost, we need a proper legal framework, and that was subject of discussion in the previous session. I'm not going to repeat that. But on top of that, I think that manufacturers can play a role in that sector. For example, by joining producer responsibility organizations that only contract with certified plants. So plants that really have been certified to standards such as EN 5625, because these lay down really the official management practices, and also cover health requirements and safety requirements and so forth. And we have long been arguing also with the European Electronics Recycling Association and the producers associations that these standards should become legally binding. They should become mandatory. They should be sitting in the European law or in other laws for that matter. But this is not yet the case. So it remains all in all a voluntary approach. That's number one. There are many other things that let's say the sector can do, that the value chain can do, because the next step, of course, beyond the WE directive is to really focus on the value chain. We have to go beyond the linear economy, the disposal economy, looking only at the waste, and we have to go to a value chain approach, which is also the approach taken in batteries regulation, or the draft regulation proposed by the European Commission. It means, for example, due diligence in the value chain. It also, for example, for batteries, it's due diligence with respect to cobalt, natural graphite, lithium, and nickel. And in my opinion, we need the same approach for electronics. And we really need to start a conversation around how do we turn the linear economy into a circular economy, and also due diligence in the value chain. And but of course, that's a tall order. And what is absolutely also a key concern in the WE area is that, and you mentioned it, Matthias, before, and Matthias Buchert as well, is that a collection, a formal collection, meaning a collection of electronic waste that is formally reported to the authorities, remains 55% in Europe. 55%. Globally, it's not even 20%. It's estimated to be 17%. So globally, e-waste, only 17% of the e-waste that arises is reported to the authorities and is properly recycled, is reported as properly recycled. In Europe, it's 55%, I say, but this is after 20 years of WE legislation, of e-waste, EPR legislation. So this is quite astounding in a way. So there's a huge scope for improvement. So we really have to make sure that we bring all the actors around the table and make sure that everyone who has access to electronic waste has responsibility with respect that he has to fulfill. This is really a very important point, because EPR stands for extended producer responsibility, not exclusive producer responsibility. It's producers that have to be made responsible, but it's not they are not exclusively. They don't have all the access to the e-waste that is arising. There are other actors as well on the market that have access to e-waste. And so we have to make sure that whoever has access to e-waste is sitting around a table and has responsibilities which are enforced by the authorities. This is a message that many actors in the market recognize, but I think they should now be embedded in legislation. And that's it as an introductory statement.
Okay, thank you, Pascal. I think that already contains a lot of expressions and words and statements for discussion. I would like to move over to another actor in the value chain, that's or who represents another actor in the value chain. That's Martin Eriksson. He comes from engineering, a practical person. Who was involved in different roles in manufacturing industry for the past decade. So lots of experience from that side, what is possible, what is feasible, etc. Now he's head of copper sales at Boliden. I think the interesting thing is that Boliden launched a low carbon and recycled copper products or standards. So first ISO verified low carbon copper products in the world. So I think that's an interesting start. So Martin, what would be your intro statement about the feasibility of responsible sourcing of secondary raw materials?
Thank you, Matthias, and thank you, Pascal. Well, it's being in the place in the value chain where Boliden is. We are a mining and a smelting company, so we actually do mine virgin material, and we also smelt, and we also have recycling facilities where we recycle non-ferrous metals. And since I work mostly with copper in these questions, that would be most of my expertise. But the challenge in the value chain and the question when it comes to responsible circular economy and responsibility is a challenge for Boliden, because how far back in the value chain, how far back in the recycling are we able to be responsible? Because there's always challenges, of course. We don't know where the metal came from in the start, when it entered into the economy to start with. And most of the time, we don't know where it came from when we buy it either. Of course, we only buy from big players that we do due diligence on. We don't buy from exotic, so to say, places and regions. We buy fairly locally. As Pascal mentioned, 55% roughly in the EU of the e-waste is recycled. And most of that e-waste ends up in Sweden, where it's made into metal again. But we also buy from other places in the world. And it is a challenge. And it's also talking about the carbon footprint. So being responsible in recycling is that the e-waste contains a lot of plastics. It contains a lot of different plastics. How can we separate these plastics from the metals in an efficient way and limiting the footprint of the recycling? And this is a challenge that we at Boliden and myself personally see that we need to take care of together going forward. Because right now, you mentioned, Matthias, that Boliden launched its low carbon copper. And the carbon footprint, cradle to gate, on recycled e-waste is the same as the carbon footprint for copper that's mined and smelted and produced into copper from one of our Swedish mines. So from an emissions point of view, it's a level playing field because of all the plastics that's in the e-waste right now. But on the other hand, and Pascal, you might correct me if I'm wrong, when you look at copper specifically, copper is a valuable metal. And the recycling rate on most copper products is very high, with the exception for e-waste, where we look at less than 20% recycling. And that ends up on landfills. So it's a challenge. How can we get the metal out of especially e-waste? How can we get it back into the circularity and make metals from it again and help with the energy transition? And how can we do it in a responsible and with as little impact to the environment as possible?
Okay, thank you, Martin. So what I hear out is, so the limits, it's the big question, how far can we be held, or can we actually take our responsible, how far back in the value chain? And the second thing is that responsibility or responsible sourcing is also connected very strongly with the overall footprint of a solution. So then I'm coming to the next speaker, and that's that's Thea Kleinmarkt. Thea Kleinmarkt is from Fairphone Circular Material, is a circular material innovator where she fosters fair circularity and decreases the environmental footprint throughout the life cycle of smartphones. She joined Fairphone in 2020 to change the electronics industry from the inside out and to use the manifold opportunities to make a positive impact. Previously, she researched raw material criticality in the telecom sector from an environmental, social, and economic perspective with the Dutch telecommunication service provider KPN. Thea holds a master's degree in industrial ecology from Delft University. And I think the interesting thing here is that with Fairphone, we have a player also here who is also stretched over quite a large part of the value chain, and as a producer tries to source responsibly all its product, especially also from secondary resources. So Thea, what are your introduction statements for this?
Yes, thank you very much for this introduction. So first, I'd like to introduce Fairphone a little bit so that the context is clear. So Fairphone is a smartphone manufacturer, and we have the goal to challenge the electronics industry on its sustainability issues. So that means that we first create awareness in the industry and prove that it can be done differently, and also then afterwards motivate the industry to follow us to produce more sustainable electronics. And among others, our focus areas in which we want to challenge the industry is circularity, but we also care about mining, since we need a fair transition to a circular economy. And recycled materials are not per se good, because we don't know if they are responsible or not. And mined materials are not always bad. So we really need a granulate view on this topic. And when it comes to responsible sourcing of secondary raw materials, we focus so far on post-consumer recycled materials for achieving a lower environmental impact. And for achieving a social impact, we are currently mapping and investigating our supply chain, and there explore possibilities to reroute our supply. At the same time, we always need to ask what is responsible and fair. So we need to have this discussion, because that's also not always clear what it actually means. And therefore, we promote continuous improvement, which means that when you start a project and start sourcing, it does not necessarily directly need to be perfect. That's also not really possible, because you need to identify and seizing the opportunities along the way and with the parties that you work with in that process.
Okay, thank you, Thea. Actually, I quite like the notion of, okay, if we have challenges, maybe we don't have the perfect solution, but we are committed to improve. No, we still start with it, but we're committed to improve. So I take this as a key message away from your introduction statement. Then we're coming to Olivier Groux. Olivier specializes in environmentally friendly battery dismantling. He did that already in his research and in his education, and he is now working for Keyboards in Switzerland, who is producing, I think if I do that right, little scooters for the post, the Swiss Post, and which are, of course, which are driven by batteries. And he's especially looking into the end of life management of these batteries. He worked at the DSM Nutrition product as a chemical laboratory technician, so also brings that know-how with him when it comes to batteries. He's at Keyboards, he's responsible for the process development, the successful implementation of a direct recycling process to separate the different components of used lithium batteries without chemical treatment, and the closure of the battery cycle. So I think he can also, maybe Olivier, you can also point when in your intro statement or later in the discussion also about the feasibility when it really comes to technical implementation of responsibly recycling, also especially batteries, so our new technologies for today and tomorrow. Olivier.
Thank you, Matthias. Yes, exactly. So to give you, as you told, we are producing electric vehicles, and our responsibility in this is also that we are, like, after 7-8 years, we are buying these vehicles back to give them again a new chance to go out again. So we are doing a second life vehicles, and we can reuse a lot of materials again. And also with batteries that are not good enough, we are doing third life applications. So we are also reusing batteries again. So at Keyboards, we are trying not to talk about waste. We are trying to talk about materials that still have a value, to keep them as long as possible in the circle. And yes, at the end, Martin Keyboards was not happy with the system of burning material, like burning batteries, to lose these values. So that's why we did our own battery recycling process to take like 91% of the materials back and try them to provide them to, again, to producer, to keep the materials in the loop.
Okay, thank you, Olivier. Maybe an add-on question for you. You're doing this. You're doing this because you were not happy, or your founder was not happy with previous solutions. So, what is the major incentive you have for engaging in this business to keep these materials in the loop, recycling it, address the circular economy of this? But also, what are the main obstacles for you, or the main issues?
I mean, in Switzerland, you are learning at school that we don't have any raw materials in the country. And that's not really true, because if you're looking around, there is plenty of raw material. We just have to open the eyes and use them again. And that's my plan, to recover this raw material. And my biggest challenge is firstly to have a constant quality that I'm taking out of the batteries, because a battery is not equal a battery after 15 years. They are different. Like, some batteries are working in the mountains, some batteries are working in cities. So the quality, it's not really the same. So the biggest challenge is to provide constant quality to the producer, and to provide them with a good price. And I think this is a very I think at the moment the primary raw material are too cheap, and this is a big problem. And I think if the primary material would rising, we would not have any problem with recycling. Everyone would do it and stop buying just new materials.
Okay, thanks, Olivier. So actually, it's about the economics, and maybe that also brings me back to Thea. Fairphone is. I mean, what is your take on the economics of that? How do you deal with the fact that you try to actually source your raw materials responsibly, but actually also looking at secondary raw materials, but the economics would tell you otherwise? So how do you handle this? Do you see any trade-offs in your approach as well?
Yes, for sure. So of course, basically having better practices than many other manufacturers means that we also have to spend more money on the project that we invest in. So of course, this is an economic part, but there are also positives on this, because of course we are really a purpose-driven company, and we want to prove that it is possible to make this business model work, because the consumers nowadays really are facing, or we are all together facing, a lot of issues such as the climate crisis. And also the consumers therefore demand products which are more sustainable than others. So that's also how Fairphone started, because there was no alternative on the smartphone market which was more sustainable, although customers were actually willing to buy it. And this is also what we see here. So that the brand image is really important also, and that we really can underpin the impact that we have. And for that, of course, we can also, basically ask a higher price, because we can show that we really do good with the money by supporting all these projects and undertaking this effort and trying to take the industry along.
So, but still, when it comes to economics, I mean, you're still a business, no? I mean, you're a dedication and you have a aim. So what is then the business model? Is it that you're a niche, or I mean, how can you ensure, or the other way around? What would have to change that actually your business model is also working in a larger scale?
Well, we are currently scaling up. So currently we are for sure still a niche, but we see that our business model, or that there is a market for us also to grow. And so in general, what needs to change is, of course, the minimum what manufacturers have to comply with legally. So if every smartphone manufacturer needs to adhere to certain standards, then we are creating a level playing field again. So also that the prices will adjust to that. So also other manufacturers have to engage, and therefore they also have to, we need to create also a responsible supply, which one company alone, it is really hard to get to this supply and to really scale it up. But the more companies are really forced into looking at such supplies, alternative supplies, the more we have it available, and the more we have a bigger market to also source from it, and to change the whole sector also more tiers down the supply chain. So this is a very important point.
Martin, is this also an important point for your business, because you're actually the one who can provide these responsibly sourced secondary raw materials? Is this like a market you see, a demand you see?
Well, I have to maybe I come across as the evil ugly mining company here, but you know, there's no better place for us to make money than with recycling material. That's where we make money. There's no better gold mine. There's no gold concentrate, so the input material they put into the smelter. There's no better gold concentrate than e-waste, than electronics waste. So this is lucrative business if you can do it right, from our perspective. So the recycling part of our business is very profitable. So we don't see that part. When it comes to responsibility, when it comes to reducing the footprint and so forth, then I think it's important that we get something in place that the end consumer, the end user, actually has to pay for their footprint. So right now, you don't pay for your footprint. For fossil fuels, definitely not. For electronics, definitely not. For a sustainably produced metal versus a non-sustainably produced metal, you don't. So you have to start to pay for your footprint. So there must be a taxonomy change that you actually get a price tag on this for that. That way, it will be even better business for everyone to work even more on their footprint. Today, if we look at it, of course, there's debate, but carbon capture. we are looking at putting carbon capturing on our e-waste handling so that we actually reduce the carbon emissions to the atmosphere. That's at a high cost, and we're not going to get that cost back when we sell the metal until the end user actually have to pay for the footprint, because then you're either going to pay for the carbon capturing and getting a cleaner metal, or you will not and buy and pay it on the final product. So in our part of the value chain, as a mining and smelting company, recycling is good business, has been and will be. But to get it to become even better and get it to become even cleaner, I think that everyone needs to actually pay their share and pay the final product.
So actually, we're talking here about how can we go the extra mile and actually be consistent with what we're doing, actually being responsible. No.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
Yeah. So actually, paying for the footprint, that reminds me to a concept which has been mentioned already at the beginning. It's extended producer responsibility. So this is a question for Pascal. I mean, is this the tool we can use to actually leverage this idea, also then improve, of course, the circularity of primary and secondary resources?
Yeah, I fully endorse what Martin just said. I mean, I think one of the causes of the dramas of the climate crisis and so many crises is the fact that we don't pay for the externalities. So he mentioned footprint, but there are many other types of externalities. And unless we as individuals pay for the externalities, we won't be making much progress. And I think it's very commendable what Fairphone is doing and Kibbutz. In all fairness, I think it's fantastic. But unless we have a legal framework that puts these things into practice, or let's say that mandates them, that makes them legally required, such as due diligence, we won't be making much progress. But I think it's commendable that the Fairphone is doing this responsible sourcing, is trying to prove that its alternative business model works in practice. But we, of course, this is just one company, and we have to transpose this onto a whole sector. And so I already mentioned that due diligence, it's in the battery regulation, but as long as it is not also a mandatory requirement in the WEEE legislation, we're not going to make much progress, in my opinion. I read one on the previous, I think it was Marco from the European Commission was mentioning, or sorry, Luca from the Commission was mentioning that next month we will see the Sustainable Products Initiative, which is actually a legislative instrument launched by the European Commission that will lay down the rules for life cycle extension, for durability, recyclability, and so forth. And I think that's very important because, Matthias, you mentioned extended producer responsibility, but the point is that consumers should have also, let's say, repair should be fostered under regulated frameworks, and also companies should be incentivized to extend the life cycle, the lifetime of their products. This is currently not the case. And that's the reason why many people are talking about planned obsolescence. I'm not saying, I'm not making bold statements about planned obsolescence, but it's a critique that is often leveraged. And so we need another conversation, not just extended producer responsibility, but also what can we do to what initiative do we need to take to make products more sustainable, so more durable, and so forth. Also, for example, sharing economy. We've been talking about this in the Circular Economy Action Plan, and some companies are trying to implement this idea of sharing your products in the vehicles industry, for example. But probably we need to take this to a higher level. We need to, let's say, to scale it differently. Another example is the conflict minerals, Matthias. So the conflict minerals regulation, for example, now regards minerals, but perhaps when we revise that regulation, we should extend it also to products containing the minerals. And that would be a big leap forward, because it would mean that that when you import products into the European Union, you also need to know where the products or the components sitting in the products come from, where they are sourced. And I think that would be a huge advantage. Of course, I agree with Thea that we are all on a learning curve, so you won't have perfection from day one, but the conflict minerals legislation is something that can be improved by extending it to products and not just to minerals.
Okay, that sounds very good, interesting, and I totally agree. It's also about incentives. It's about providing the framework legislation, integrating into existing legislation. So, but for me, it's also, I mean, that's one side, but maybe there's also another driver. It's the demand. Starting at the consumer, but maybe then also at the companies, and maybe that's a question. I mean, there's obviously a demand from Fairphone for such produced raw materials, and also for products for their clients. But I mean, do you feel already a demand? Maybe starting with Olivier, who actually sells also a kind of a product or a service. Is there a demand? Do you feel that? Or if not enough, what do you think? What is this the way to go, like Pascal just pointed out?
So if I split it to the second life vehicles or the second life energy system storage, we have a lot of demand because people want to be more environmental friendly, and they also pay the same price as a new one. So the demand is there to change something, doing something for the environment. And for the raw material for the batteries, I think at the moment we are too little and we have not as much materials to sell that. So the demand is coming from a research institute that want to build new batteries with this material. So yes, I think the demand will come. I think so.
Okay, I think we are. What I hear, we are still in an initial state, but the direction is given and is probably the correct one. I just want to move over to questions I have from the audience. I at least see one thing. I see somebody from the audience said, Martin said at the beginning that Boliden does not know where the end of copper comes from. I guess it had something to do with the value chain, no? That you maybe cannot go back as much as somebody wants. So does this mean from which products you don't know? And is that an issue of suppliers not sharing information? Or what's the reason for that?
No, I was referring to when recycling, especially electronic waste, that comes from collection centers. It comes from, at least in Sweden, all the retailers also have to take back the old electronic equipment and send it to recycling. When we purchase this from larger companies, we purchase this in small pieces. We don't know exactly where the e-waste comes from, what product, if it's how it's marked in accordance to WEEE standards. We don't know where the metal in these components come from in the first place. It could be metal from countries with work environment issues and other environmental issues or whatever in the first place. So that, you know, there's no way to track the atom for the initial source. And of course, that is a challenge, and we can only go down so far to our suppliers. That's what I meant with that statement.
Yeah, I think Pascal wants to add something on that.
Yeah, there's one thing that the French have done is a ban on cash transactions, and it's actually a measure that avoids that people just bring electronic components, whatever the case may be, to recyclers, and this is not reported, is not registered. And so the French implemented this, and it allows for more transparency of the financial transactions in the sector. And actually, we raised this at the European Commission as a measure perhaps they should implement throughout the European Union, but the response was negative. But I think it's a relatively simple measure that you can take to make the sector more responsible at that level.
That's an interesting thought, Pascal. But I'm just thinking now of my work. I was also involved in Africa, and Africa is a cash society, so we've extended thinking to a global supply chain, and thinking of an informal sector who sells their copper to a company. How would you address that in that case?
I think you underestimate the importance of the mobile phones in Africa. I mean, as far as I know, it plays a very big role in making markets more efficient, and not just the electronics market, also supply and demand for fish and so forth. So I think that Africans are very, very attached to their mobile phones as a means of managing their business.
You're probably correct. It's actually a means of not using cash anymore, which developed extremely fast in the past years, and probably will develop much faster, and maybe makes this cash society changes it quite a bit. So maybe that's a possibility. What you also said also reminds me, actually, that you can track back this. I once had a talk with a banker, and they're selling responsible gold. And I said, how would that work with secondary gold? And they say, well, we cannot deal with secondary gold because we will never know where this is coming from, and our clients don't want to buy this type of gold. Of course, this is also about finances and investments, but it's quite interesting. So I think there must be a way to circumstance this. We are getting the end of this discussion. I want to give you the chance to give a final statement. That means what you want to give the audience as a key takeaway in 1 or 2 sentences. Please keep it short, these statements, so that we're not running over time. I start with Thea.
Yeah, so supply chains, at least in the electronic sector, are so complex and transparency is lacking there, so that we really need to acknowledge that we cannot control everything in there. And social and environmental hotspots are part of every electronic supply chain, and that's why we have to implement a proactive approach to really observe and then learn and improve the situation, instead of finding ways to avoid risks for the own specific supply chain. And while we need to move towards a circular economy, we have to keep in mind that this transition will take decades, and mining will also remain a key source of supply and a livelihood for many people. And therefore, both the fair mine supply and also keeping the extracted resources in the loop need really to be focused in the circular economy discourse.
Okay. Thank you, Thea. Olivier?
My statement, I don't know, just don't talk about waste, look the product as a value and work with it.
Okay, good statements, I think. Martin?
Recycling is key, but looking at copper and the energy transition that we're looking at, which will be extremely copper intense if we're going to electrify and change the source of energy generation. Recycling will be a part of it, and it will be an extremely important part. But unfortunately, we will still need to have mining. And then we should make sure that we have mining in the right places of the world, where we can do it in a responsible way, from an environmental perspective, from a humanity perspective, and we should probably consider having some of it in Europe as well. And secondly, urban mining. There's roughly 700 mobile phones in the EU alone. sitting in a drawer. Please recycle.
Okay, I think Pascal would agree to that, definitely.
Yes.
But you might have also another statement for the end, Pascal.
Yeah, I strongly agree with this. Of course, we did the International E-Waste Day a couple of weeks ago, where we really told the world, please return your old mobile phones or whatever electrical gear you have in drawers. It's absolutely true. 1 out of 7 products in the home are unused or not functioning, and could be taken back to a collection point. But what I want to say as a concluding remark is that I strongly believe that the circular economy will be digital or will not be. And so we really need to research how the value chain can become more digital. And I think the digital product passport, for example, is going to be one initiative that will that will turn this into a reality. And we have to take this very seriously. And I personally see many opportunities. Of course, there are also a number of challenges, but I strongly believe that this is the direction we need to go.
Okay, thanks a lot. I see one common denominator in this feedback is actually that when we talk about responsibility and secondary resources, circular economy, I think that you would like to still keep the discussion open and not just talk about recycling, which of course is important, but still keep in mind that we are also still will need in the future primary mining, and that has to be done responsible too. So with this, I would like to give back to the facilitator, Ursula, and to head over to the next program item. Thank you very much, the speakers, panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you for this great discussion here, to have all these different views and all these practical insights as well. Thank you so much for this part. As the next part, I would like to present some projects we want to show you. But before we go there, my quick reminder again, could you have maybe a minute or two to fill in the survey that we have on the project website, so that we learn about how this conference was for you and how much you could take from it. Resourcing is an EU project that wants to connect with other related projects or initiatives. And that's why we have showed you the day before yesterday and yesterday some other projects, and we want to show you 2 more projects today. There are 2 Horizon 2020 projects. One is Sea Waste, that developed a voluntary certification scheme for waste treatment. And the other one is Black Cycle, improving circularity in the tire industry. Let us present these 2 projects, and then there will be time for question and answers. Please put your questions in to the Slido at any time, and they will be answered by the presenters. So may I welcome here first Sharaz Manocheri, and I would like to learn how to pronounce your name properly, from the project Sea Waste. She's the project manager at the World Resources Forum Association. And this project just finished a couple of weeks ago, actually. It's an H2020 project, and you are also partner in resourcing now, which is very nice. Your project developed a voluntary certification scheme for waste treatment. In particular, it launched a scheme for collection, transport, and treatment facilities of waste containing valuable and critical raw materials. I'm happy to hear about that, and please, would you present your project?
Yes, thanks a lot, Ursula, for the introduction, and thanks to all participants for joining this session. My name is Sharzad Manocheri. I know it's a difficult name. And next slide, please. As Ursula mentioned, the main objective of the Sea Waste project was to develop a voluntary certification scheme and validate this scheme for recycling of key types of waste that contain sufficiently high amounts of valuable and critical raw materials. The Sea Waste project was coordinated by the World Resources Forum and was implemented by a multidisciplinary consortium bringing expertise from different parts of the value chain, from waste collection and treatment, from research on critical raw materials, standardization and certification. C-Waste commenced in 2018, in November 2018, and it concluded in April this year, 2021. Next slide, please. Actually, thanks to previous panel discussions and panelists, I don't need to say a lot about the challenges and about this slide. The project was obviously a response to the challenges associated with sustainable access to critical raw materials that are essential for high-tech industry and emerging technologies. And as we all know, and we heard in the previous days of this conference, as well as today, the supply of these materials is associated with various environmental, social, and governance risks. And again, as we heard today, access to secondary sources of critical raw materials is a way to mitigate risks associated with supply of critical raw materials. But the current challenge is that for many critical raw materials, especially the ones that are needed in high-tech applications, secondary production through recycling makes only a marginal contribution to meet EU demand of critical raw materials. And the truth is that recycling of critical raw materials is a complex process, and to increase recycling rates, various but interlinked solutions are proposed, and these are needed. And to implement these solutions, policy actions, regulations, and improved legislative frameworks are required. We also heard today, this early afternoon, from the keynote speaker about the importance of these legislative frameworks. And among different approaches, the standardization is obviously needed to support these policy actions, which can also lead to a level playing field. So this was the background, and this was why the C-Waste project was born in 2018. Next slide, please. To achieve its objective, the project followed 5 key steps. The first step was to conduct a baseline analysis to understand the current situation. To understand the situation by mapping the existing recovery practices, products that contain critical raw materials, related standards and verification schemes, to also define the gaps and obstacles that are existing. Then in the next step, we develop new normative requirements and the related assurance system and verification procedures. And it was also important for us to test and validate what we have produced, to check their practicality and feasibility in real life operations through pilot audits. And based on the learnings, we developed a roadmap for long-term sustainability of this scheme, and also recommendations for the Commission on how to improve the recycling rate of critical raw materials. And of course, through the process, we try to ensure a transparent stakeholder participation through various consultation process. Next slide, please. Yeah, after this introductory part, I would like now to highlight the key results and outcomes of the project. Based on a set of economic and technical criteria that we defined at the beginning of the project, we defined the scope by identifying or selecting the key critical raw materials equipment and key critical raw materials components that we call them KCE and KCC, and also the type of critical raw materials that are included in these components or equipment. As you can see in this table, our focus was on waste electrical and electronics and batteries in V and end-of-life vehicles. And the key CRM components that were selected for the purpose of the project were printed circuit boards from different types of V, lithium-ion batteries and lead-acid batteries from V and end-of-life vehicles, fluorescent powders from V, and neodymium magnets from V and ELVs, end-of-life vehicles. And it's important to mention that in our scope, we also consider the valuable or precious metals in the list of the materials that we were looking for. Next slide, please. In the last 3 days of this conference, we heard several times that there are lots of standards available, and it can be sometimes confusing for the operators to identify which standard to use or to implement. So by being aware of this fact, one of the cornerstones of the project was that we did not want to reinvent the wheel or develop a new standard from scratch, but we really wanted to take stock of what is already available and build on the existing standards by focusing on the gaps that are needed for critical raw materials. To do this, we mapped and analyzed more than 60 relevant normative frameworks, and the results showed that there are very few critical raw materials-specific non-technical requirements, very few technical requirements with relevance for key CRM components, and hardly any technical requirements specifically for recycling of critical raw materials in the existing normative framework. Another key result of this mapping exercise was that the EN 50625 standards series, which is the European standard on collection, logistics, and treatment requirements for V adopted by Senelec, can be considered as a basis for development of the C-waste requirements. And in cases where Senelec standard was not sufficient, we then referred to other existing relevant standards, and only when there was a real gap, then we developed new requirements. Next slide, please. Yeah, as I said, the development of the new set of requirements included technical requirements for the key CRM components that we had identified: batteries, magnets, fluorescent powders, and printed circuit boards, sustainability requirements, as well as traceability requirements that would apply to lead-acid batteries and printed circuit boards. I should also mention here that for the development of the traceability requirements, of course, we gave a reference to the OECD due diligence documents that are available on traceability. Next slide, please. And to ensure the conformity of facilities with the C-waste normative requirements, the related assurance system and verification procedures and mechanisms were also developed. As shown in this slide, we also developed the scheme rules, the scheme processes, the scheme assessments, as well as certification process or verification procedures that are needed, and manuals for operators and auditors. And these were in different forms, like templates or tools or checklists that were developed within this task. Next slide, please. Once the draft version of the requirements and these tools were available, then the feasibility and practicality of these were tested in real-life operations through pilot audits. Between March and December 2020, as you can imagine, a challenging time, we conducted 20 pilot audits in Europe, in some European countries, and also in Colombia and Rwanda. We did the pilot audits. Through these pilots, and as well as several rounds of online public consultation where we published the normative requirements that we had developed, and we asked the stakeholders to provide feedback on what we had developed, we collected more than 600 comments, and these were used to improve the normative requirements and the assurance system, and also to understand the readiness level of the operators for critical raw materials recycling. I'm just highlighting some of these key points that were provided or observed during this audit process. What we heard a lot was that critical raw materials recycling is not economically viable, of course, at the current situation. There is lack of recycling technologies for some specific critical raw materials. There is difficulty to access components that are needed for recycling. Low concentration of critical raw materials in products, lack of legal frameworks, and many more. Next slide, please. Based on all these learnings, we then identified a set of integrated policy actions for improving the recovery of critical raw materials. That these options, in most cases, they can work together, not as a single solution. The first pillar is, of course, legislation. We recommended that there should be legal obligation to recover critical raw materials. There should be mandatory recycled content for critical raw materials. As was again discussed earlier today, the good example or the good direction of battery regulation can be mentioned as an example for this process. And these are needed to create a market pool for recycled critical raw materials. Obviously, legal obligation without existence of economic viability will not work. The second pillar is to make sure the implementation is possible. Stimulating platforms or markets for recycled critical raw materials should be created. There is a need to invest in technologies and infrastructure for critical raw materials recycling, and also new collection models or grouping of critical raw materials rich products is needed. We heard a lot from through the pilot audits that the input needed for recycling processes is lacking. At monitoring and reporting is, of course, the next important pillar, and the opportunity to use innovative models like digital product passport can enable better traceability. Again, I'm happy that I could hear this was also mentioned during previous panel discussions. And obviously, legislation will not work if there is not enforcement, which is the next pillar in our recommendations. Next slide, please. And the last but not the least is that we developed a roadmap for long-term sustainability of the scheme. And in the main components or concrete steps for this roadmap is that the Senelec standard should be made mandatory, and the C-waste standard as part of it, as part of the Senelec, should also be mandatory. And we also defined that there should be a call for action for member states to increase collection of critical raw material, rich materials, create market pool, as it was discussed in the previous slide, facilitate creation of demand for recycled components or material, push for more policies and investments to ensure economic viability of the process, and also push for research and development of technologies for better and more efficient processes. The next slide, please, which is my last slide. And with this, I would like to thank you again for inviting Seaways to this session. And I also wanted to mention that all documents and the tools and the manuals that were produced during this project are available on our website, publicly available, and you can also contact me for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation there. And there's one question from the audience. Is it the products, the product components, the manufacturers, and their suppliers that are certified?
The recycling, actually the certification, the value chain that we considered for this certification scheme would include the collection points, collection facilities, the pre-treatment, also logistics and transport, pre-treatment and final treatment facilities of the waste electrical and electronic, as well as the batteries in V and end-of-life vehicles. This was the scope of the project and the certification scheme, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you so much for presenting this. And I'm looking forward to exchanging with you after the official end of the conference in our informal exchange.
Thank you.
All of you are also very welcome to join this informal exchange with the presented projects at the very end. And this also brings me to the next project we want to present to you. This is called Black Cycle, which will be presented by Margarita Dorato, project manager at Michelin or Michelin, if you want to say it. This is also an Age 2020 project. Hello, nice to meet you. This is running until 2023, I suppose. And the Black Cycle project is an innovation action aimed at improving circularity of the tire industry by developing a full value chain based on recycled end-of-life products. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much for this introduction. Hello everyone. I'm very glad to introduce Black Cycle project. So I'm Margarita Dorato. As you can see, I come from Michelin, and I'm the technical director of the Black Cycle project. As you said, it's an Age 2020 project, and it's a research and innovation program. And today, Black Cycle is a major European project for recycling end-of-life tires, ethanol tires. Yes, I know it's not the same industry than the electronic and so on, but it's a very important one for the mobility aspect. So please go to the next slide. What is the challenge? So annually, like this, you know a little more about tire industry. I want to give you some key figures. So annually, there are 1.6 million tires become waste worldwide. So that means 26 million tons of this material. In Europe, particularly, there are 3.5 million tons of end-of-life tires each year. In fact, only a limited amount of the second-hand raw material coming off these end-of-life tires can be reused into new tires, into the tire industry. In fact, in Europe, more than half of these end-of-life tires are exported to the other country to be valorized, but for the moment they are exported. And that gives us a great potential for the material recovery. As somebody said in the other presentation, for me, waste is a potential of material recovery. So it's for that today we launched a Black Cycle project. Next slide, please. In mid-2020. Black Cycle is a 3.5-year project, and Black Cycle project aims to enable a massive circular economy of tires. Yes, Michelin as coordinator has thrown together 12 partners to create, develop, and optimize a full value chain from end-of-life tire to secondary raw material with no waste in any part of the value chain, and we take a specific attention for the more environmental impact, holistic and local impact for the value chain that we develop. This value chain should be able to valorize 100% of the end-of-life tire that will be treated with this value chain. And that could improve the recycled content by 10 in the tire. Because today, some tire, there are around 1-2% of end-of-life tire into a new tire, and in the project we want to improve this quantity up to 25%. Yes, to introduce the second raw material that we will develop from the end-of-life tire into new tires, and as well this value chain should be able to recycle at least 15% of the European end-of-life tires. As you see, Black Cycle will offer an economically and environmentally alternative, and we will reduce the waste export. Next slide, please. Michelin, as coordinator, has united 7 industrial partners, 5 research and technological organizations, and the clusters into an European consortium in 5 countries. Yes, over the 13 partners, we find all the key skills to succeed the value chain. Yes, we find waste manager, we find technology developer and provider, and of users and end users and validators, technology provider and manufacturer, and as well expert around the environmental aspect and the health and safety assessment as well. Yes, so this over these 13 partners, we want to go through technological barrier and non-technological barrier. So please, next slide. For the technological barrier, Black Cycle project aimed to create and develop a full value chain from the end-of-life tire up to the secondary raw material. So all the partners are around all the value chains. We have Aliapure, that is a manager, a waste manager, to give us the input around the collect of the tires. Estato and ERA are working in the sorting and the graining to have the better rubber granulate to go through the pyrolysis, to optimize the condition, to have the best secondary raw material at the end, to make synthesis and to produce sustainable raw material for tire industry, but not only, as well other kind of industry. So Michelin at the end will take all this new raw material to make the conception and develop new tire that with the same performance as today, because that have a very impact in the global life cycle assessment. So the idea of the key point in Black Cycle is to have an economic and value chain, to have high technological secondary raw material for tire industry. So you can go to next. Thank you. To go a little more in detail about how to develop the pilot plan to recycle end-of-life tire on high technical secondary raw material into tire and other application, we will develop the construction process of end-of-life tires to improve the quality and the monitoring of the chemical of content of the granulate. After that, we will develop pyrolysis process for production and recovery oil and recovery carbon black, showing the relevant properties for the synthesis of secondary raw materials. And after that, we will be working to refining and post-treatment process to extract relevant raw material as heavy oil and resins. Sorry. And this oil, after that, we will demonstrate that it's possible to produce new sustainable raw material as carbon black. Yes, with Orion, and we will try to reach the same quality as the commercial grade today. As I said, mission at the end will design and validate the performance of the tire made with sustainable raw material with high standard in quality and safety procurement. So that is for the technical barrier. But we know to have success in the value chain, there are other kinds of barriers, like non-technical. Please go to the next slide. So the project aims to facilitate the market uptake of solution, process or product that will be developed, improving the awareness of the relevant external stakeholder and the general public. How we will make that? In one hand, we want to develop a robust business model that will be dual. We will create value for our partner, but as well we want to make the replication of this business model around Europe. But we know we have other constraints to implement that around Europe. It will be the integration of the regulation constraints for the implementation of the future plant throughout Europe, as well for the new product, because we know the end of waste status when we make process to recycling is not easy to commercialize as secondary raw material around Europe, because when in one country it's not a waste, in other country is already a waste. It depends of each country. So that is a key point that we want to work in this project. And at the end, we know that the social acceptance is a key point, because we want to develop and deploy a new industry to recover and recycling tires. Yes, and for that we have to be sure that the society are ready to go on to this new industry transition. Yes. So the 3-point business model, regulation and social acceptance, they are very linked, I think, with resources project. Yes, please go to the next slide. So the resources team asked me how is the synergy with the resourcing project. Yes, I think to be able to success the circular economy, the first step is to create network. Yes, because for me, it's the key factor in the circular economy is the philosophy. To create a new industry, all the actors have to be linked. As well, I think we will be inspiring of the scaling up of the best practice that resourcing projects want to develop and define. And at the end, to be linked in the supportive EU policy framework, because as I say, I think all society, but as well policy, have to be aligned to go through the new industry, the new circular economy to be success on the end. So thank you very much to give me the opportunity today to present my project, to present our objective and ambition, and to create a network with you. And thank you. Don't hesitate if you have any questions.
Thank you very much, Margarita. There are questions indeed. The first one is closing the loop of type value chain. Sorry, this just moved a little bit. Closing the loop of tire wheel value chains is an important step towards product responsibility, of course. In what regards do other aspects next to circularity, such as a low carbon footprint, play a role for your approach in Black Cycle?
In Black Cycle, we have two points, very important point. We see the life cycle assessment along the value chain. Yes. We have to take in account one point. Today, if we say we will make the same tire, and that is our main hypothesis, or value chain, we estimate, yes, we think that we have to validate at the end of the project. For the moment, the first estimation, we will decrease about 50% the emission around the sustainable raw material from the fossil one. Yes, that is a key point. Yes, but as I say, the performance of the tire is a key point. The difference with the other kind of project, because using secondary raw materials in the tire, you can have some decrease the performance that have a huge impact at the end in the life cycle assessment in the CO2 emission. For example, I give you an information today in the global life cycle assessment of the tire, up to 19% is coming from the performance of the tire. If you change that, we will have a high impact at the end. So we keep the same performance. That is a key point for us. It's not only to put more recovery. It's not only circularity. It's as well life cycle assessment.
Okay. There's one more question we could maybe take from the panel discussion we had before. With upcoming regulatory approaches to responsible sourcing and responsibility on CE systems, do you see your business model, such as Cuberts or Fairphone, endangered as more competitions are moving into the market, more competitors? Or do you see this as a chance to expand your market?
That we can see about the business model. Yes, we know that about the business model is very challenging. We think we will be competitive with the fossil industry, but as you know, the fossil industry is a very efficient one because they have a lot of time. So we work in the value chain to optimize this aspect. So it's for that we think about the social acceptance. In one hand, it will be the willingness to pay of the client. It has to be a key point. The other thing as well, the regulatory as well, because if in the next years we say, okay, now we have to have a target in the recovery material or circularity in a new tire, that could help us to go and to improve the business model of the circularity.
Okay, thank you. And as we have a little bit of time left, there will be one more question there. Among the mentioned non-technical barriers, where do you see the most pressing call to action in order to realize a circular tire industry?
Sorry, I didn't get
concerning the non-technical barriers. So apart from technical barriers, where do you see the most pressing call to action in order to realize the circular tire industry? So what are the challenges now, and what needs to be done?
The regulatory one. Yes, because the end of waste status is a very critical one if we want to commercialize the different secondary raw material around Europe. Yes, because even for the deployment of my project today, when I have an end-of-life tire and I produce some secondary raw materials in Spain, when come to France, is considered as waste. It's very difficult to manage that and to put that again in a new tire. So that is a key point for us, and we will try to work to define the criteria where we can go through this end of waste status.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. And you're also staying until the informal exchange, right? So people can get in touch with you if they want to learn more about the project or about your views. Thank you very much. So it's my turn now to lead you towards the end of a 3-day intense conference. And I would like to hand over to my colleague, Alexander Graf, who is the manager of the resourcing project, to wrap up the 3 days. And what did you take with you, and what is still there in your head after 3 full days? Alexander.
Thank you, Ursula. Well, I think for me, actually, there is not much to say at this point. And actually, first of all, thank you. Thank you to everyone. Thank you to everyone involved in the organization, of course, first of all, for realizing these, 3 days of program and even more materials that we share in the resource library. Thank you, of course, to the moderators, to our experts who actually hosted then the different panels and also presentations. And of course, also thank you to, actually in the end, it was 30 plus speakers that we have had over the last 3 days. Other than that, actually, I would only like to take the occasion and maybe give a bit of a review of the resourcing project, what happened so far at the results, and then also a bit of a preview what lies ahead of us. And in this regard, we are sharing here once again our project roadmap. This project roadmap, as you can see on the link, is available on our website on the landing page. So please feel free to visit our website and have a look at it, because it is the most concrete and also maybe the simplest way for you to understand how you can also get involved in our project, how you can help us produce the different deliverables and outputs as we have them. And as I said, I will start with a quick review. Just over the summer, we have been able to produce our first major results, namely for the renewable energy sector, both in terms of a roadmap for responsible sourcing in the renewable energy sector until 2050, and an accompanying guidance document showing best practice or good practice cases and case studies for the different recommendations and milestones in the roadmap. So please have a look at the website, especially under project outputs, you will find these documents. But also, if you have not registered so far to the conference, please do so, and also have a look at the resource library, because these documents are also in the resource library. And the resource library will stay online until the end of this week, actually. Having said that, we also are about to start now with we already started the process on the mobility sector, namely with a state of play report that you cannot see on this map, but on this roadmap, but which is available on the website already. And also a roadmap workshop that we just had shortly before this virtual conference. This roadmap process, or this mobility sector process, will then continue with a few more activities, namely the next one being the peer learning lab, at the beginning of next year. This will be a very kind of or small group kind of workshop to which we will also in part reach out, I think, to expert partners, but it will be announced on our website. In addition, I think I would also like to raise the awareness, particularly important, to our Global Advocacy Forum in Latin America. That is also a bigger upcoming event. in June next year. It will happen in Chile, as I just said, but will also be hosted in a hybrid format, so that actually kind of also participants from around the world can join us. Last but not least, also an announcement regarding the electronic sector, the third of the three sectors that we are having here. The process for the electronic sector, both in terms of the roadmap and in terms of the good practice guidance studies, just started, with a state of play report being published, hopefully still in November, and the roadmap project and the roadmap workshop and further kind of co-creative labs and events then only starting in 2022. Again, please take the time to have a look both at the resource library for this conference, but also at our website, the different outputs that are already there. I think there's lots of different and interesting materials that we have to share with regards to responsible sourcing, particularly on the renewable energy sector, but we are also kind of starting to fill up our kind of website with the mobility sector and also the electronic sector. That's it from my side. Maybe one last time, thank you to everyone, also the audience, for joining us. And yeah, we will have one last time to catch up during this conference, namely in the last informal exchange meeting where also registered users can join us. It will start in a couple of minutes. Until then, I get back to you, Ursula. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander, for closing this or starting to close this conference. Yeah, I can announce that Alexander Graf will moderate this informal exchange. Everybody is very welcome who wants to dive deeper into those projects we just heard about and into our resourcing project. We will start that at 5:30, so in about 10 minutes, 9 or 10 minutes. There will be a separate Zoom link for you, and I'll show you in a minute how this is going to work. As Alexander already mentioned, if you have registered, you have access to a lot of informative material concerning the topic of this conference, as well as the recordings of all 3 days. They are available in the resource section of the website until Sunday this week. So it might be worth looking at them, some of it again, or sharing it with other people. We do hope that this conference was useful for you. It was definitely for us. And if you want to give us any feedback, there is a survey, a little poll on the website, and we would be happy to get some feedback from you there. Yeah, last but not least, I'm also here to mention my colleagues who have been doing constant work invisibly in the background to make such a conference a smooth event. Thank you, Constanze, Andreas, Angelo, and Noé. Thank all the expert speakers, the expert facilitators we have to have these great panel discussions over the 3 days. And last but not least, thank you, the participants, that you joined this conference. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.